So you are headhunted to investigate a grooming gang.
Yeah.
How do you get from that to sitting here where you've resigned from the police, having attempted to bring light to the issue, being fobbed off, ignored, etc.? Tell us about all that.
Well, that job that I was first recruited for was called Operation Augusta, and it was 2004, and a little girl who was 15 called Victoria Agolia had died, actually in Rochdale. She'd been horrendously groomed and sexually abused. She was living in care, and one of her abusers had given her an overdose of drugs which led to her death. Alongside that, at exactly the same time, a documentary team were making a documentary in Keighley in South Yorkshire, and that documentary was called Edge of the City. And they had uncovered a problem in Keighley where young, vulnerable, working-class white girls were being groomed, sexually abused and exploited by gangs of predominantly Pakistani men. And the powers that be within the police, I now know, feared that when that documentary went out, there would be a public outcry. And at the same time, Victoria had died in Manchester. So with hindsight, I know that GMP, Greater Manchester Police, put together a small team of officers to kind of derail the criticism that we were doing nothing about that case. But the programme went out and there wasn't the public outcry that was expected. And so Greater Manchester Police, in their wisdom, deliberately and intentionally shut down that job. The official reasoning is now, from the independent review in 2020, that the Chief Constable, the Assistant Chief Constables, Head of Crime in GMP made the conscious and deliberate decision that they would close down that job because they would not put resources into it. Now, when they closed it down, Constantine, we had over 100 paedophiles on a database that we knew were abusing children. We had about 36 children, most of whom were living in care, who were being raped on a daily basis. That happened at exactly the time that my husband died of terminal bowel cancer. I went off work for a couple of months to nurse him in his last weeks. When I came back to work, that job had died a death.
So, Maggie, sorry to interrupt.
And it's complicated, I know.
I know, it's not that it's complicated, it's hard to believe, frankly. What you're saying is the the senior police officers created an investigation in order to deflect attention from failings.
Yes.
And then when the failings went public and didn't generate a backlash, they shut down the investigation that they created to cover up for that. They
closed it in its tracks.
Even though you knew about hundreds of paedophiles who were abusing children on daily basis.
They abandoned all those young children to their abuse. And furthermore, they allowed those 100 paedophiles and more to continue to abuse for another 15 years. And it's really only because I began to, when I resigned, which is further down the road, that I never forgot those children. And pretty much every interview I do, I refer to Victoria and I refer to those children because that is not why I joined the police. You know, the police are there to prosecute paedophiles. You don't just suddenly decide that these kids don't matter. You don't do it. In my book, that's not why I joined the police. But I couldn't get any answers. I was told there was no evidence. Well, I know that was wrong because I was on that job. I knew who those kids were. And it's just wrong. But I was pretty powerless to do anything. You know, I'd just lost my husband. I've got 4 children. I was a single parent. And I didn't have a single piece of paper to prove what I was saying. And in fact, none of those rapes at that point had been recorded. So on paper, it didn't exist, but it did exist. And now, 20 years later, Andy Burnham in Manchester heard me like rabbiting on the radio, and he put together an independent review. And the review team spent 3 years looking at that job, and the official findings were, yes, there was a job. Yes, there were 100 paedophiles. Yes, there were 36 children. And GMP have now been forced to reopen that case 20 years too late because those men You think how many other children those men have prosecuted. So when I say I am not naive, I am not naive because they deliberately did that. So I don't trust them. There is a bigger agenda here, and those kids don't matter. And I always say, if those children had belonged to the Chief Constable or Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak, they would have prosecuted those men with every breath in their body. But those kids don't have anybody fighting their corner. You know, often they come from troubled backgrounds or they live in care. And you know what? It is just unforgivable. And, you know, I'm 20 years on from it. And I have been through a lot of shit in those 20 years. And I have thought I would go to prison for speaking the truth, because that's what GMP said to me when I said I was going public. But the truth is the truth. And police officers, this is not about individual police officers, because every organisation has good and bad. I was a good police officer and I did my absolute best. The people who are the bad ones are those at the top. So when the Chief Constable and Assistant Chief Constables make a deliberate decision to close a job down like that, they should be in prison, I'm afraid. They are guilty of misconduct in a public office.